Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View. Yesterday, of course, we had the Millennial Roundtable, and we're going to kind of wind down the week here. We've got a couple of things to cover. First of all, I want to say a few more things about the Canadian trucker protest, and I think some of that you can find in a very good piece that came out through the Wall Street Journal, which we've already posted. And we may also get into the issue of inflation, because the inflation rate now is the highest it's been in 40 years. Do want to give some comments about that, even how to think about that from a biblical point of view. Then later this hour, we'll have Timothy Kroll with us. And if that name sounds familiar, well, he's the son of Woodrow Kroll of Back to the Bible. They have what's called the Helios Projects, and those are certainly a great opportunity for you to know more about how we are educating the next generation of pastors in other countries. I've oftentimes said that if you travel maybe on a short-term mission project, the comment that I almost get back from people is, well, I'm not sure I know that much about the Bible. And I always assure them that, look, if you are a Christian and you've been going to church for years, maybe even occasionally listen to a Christian program on radio or listen to a Christian pastor, you probably know more than many of the individuals who have found themselves in the position of leading a flock in a country which is just now hearing the gospel. They are learning as they go along, and the greatest requirement sometimes for a pastor in some of those countries is to be one Bible study ahead of everybody else in the group. And so there is such a need to train some of these itinerant pastors and others that have become believers and want to now lead a flock. So we're going to be talking about that. I think it'll be a real encouragement to you. Next hour, we bring back to the microphone Stephen Mosher. He's been with us before. As a matter of fact, I was thinking, first interview I think Penna Dexter and I did with him was in the 1990s. I think I even interviewed him before that in the 1980s, but we've known him for some time. His book, The Bully of Asia, about China, came out years ago, but it's now in paperback, so we're going to use that to talk about, of course, the Olympics going on right now, what's going on with China, Taiwan, and the rest. And then before we're done, we will wind down the second hour by looking at, as I mentioned just the other day, the problem that we face of whiplash. That is, up until just about a week ago, everybody was absolutely convinced we need masks. Now the masks are coming off in record numbers. I've posted, of course, a particular story comes from a medical analyst at CNN, by the way, a woman that used to be the head of Planned Parenthood, a doctor who actually for quite some time argued not only that we should have masks, but that the unvaccinated should not even be allowed to leave their homes. And now she's coming out stating that, we don't need to have vaccines all the time. We can have vaccines, but we don't have to have boosters. We don't have to have masks. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And I think it illustrates the point, because as I will give you some facts and figures, we had the highest rate of COVID infections in one day in January. And you might say, well, those are infections. No, we had the highest number of deaths of COVID earlier this month. It's only what's today, the 10th of February. And so if it's the science that's changed, no, it has not. I mean, you could make a pretty good case for wanting to even extend the lockdowns, extend the masks, but something changed. Oh, yeah, we're in midterm elections, and all of a sudden, I think everybody got the memo that we've seen enough surveys to suggest that if we keep these lockdowns any longer, if we keep these mask mandates any longer, what we're going to do is lose in November. I think we're going to lose in November anyway, but that's another whole story that we will get to as well. Real quickly, let me get into this. Again, we're talking about what the truckers are doing. It fits into the category of civil disobedience. Those of you watching online, and you might want to watch online on either Facebook or our feed. I have our little booklet here on a biblical view of civil disobedience. And the first article that I've posted here is a reminder that just the other day as we were talking, you had the truckers actually block Ambassador Bridge, which, by the way, carries in round numbers about $323 million of goods across the border between the United States and Canada every single day, about $137 billion worth of goods. It was blocked for a short period of time but was reopened, so I thought I'd just mention that since we haven't really talked about it. Of course, I was off yesterday, couldn't mention that issue. But one of the articles that I've posted here by the editors of the Wall Street Journal, I think do a very good job of summarizing some of the key issues we talked about earlier. And that is, they said this latest act in a week-long show of civil disobedience is more akin to political life in France or the U.S. That it happened in restrained Canada is a signal to the political class across the West. Large swaths of humanity are done with COVID-19 restrictions, mandates, and excessive meddling in their lives. They want to go back to making their own health risk assessments. Now, they go on to point out that they believe, and I think they have been consistent, that truckers should be prosecuted if they break the law, as we argued, they say, for Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter. So those are on the left just because you're on the right, although I'm not sure how many of these people are, quote, on the right. All the comments about having Confederate flags. Really? Confederate flags in Canada? Come on. Nazi flags? No. This looks like individuals that probably, as I've seen some of the interviews, seem a little more on the left of center than right of center, but that's neither here nor there. The point is the truckers were classified as essential workers in Canada and thus exempt from vaccine mandates. Turns out the most recent estimate I see shows 85% of the truckers are vaccinated, so they're not necessarily upset about being vaccinated. Most of those that are even there honking their horns probably are. The issue is the mandate that came down. And I think if you look at the surveys, a majority of Canadians actually don't support these protests right now, according to some of the Canadian polls, if you assume that those are accurate. But here's an interesting thing. The most recent survey does show that while there may not be support necessarily for the truckers, a majority of Canadians favor lifting the restrictions that have been imposed by Justin Trudeau, which went into effect January 15th, and they see that as a great political miscalculation. We will probably spend some time tomorrow talking about this more, because as I was looking at this article, I send it on to Penna Dexter, who already gets the Wall Street Journal, and Lathan Watts, but she and I both were struck by one of the most significant statements in this piece by the Wall Street Journal editors. It's near the end of the editorial in which they say the lesson for the COVID-19 police is that when you've lost even Canadians, arguably the most law-abiding people on the planet, you've lost the political plot. And Penna said she had already written that one down. We'll probably talk about it again. But I thought it was a good piece because it, on the one hand, says if you engage in civil disobedience, when we talk about that, you should expect the consequences of that. And so there may be some people that will be arrested. Although when you have that many people, how can you arrest them all? But more importantly, I think there's a bigger lesson, whether you agree with the truckers or not, when even the Canadian people, who tend to be, as they said, perhaps much more restrained than people in France or even in the United States, when you've lost even the Canadians, the most law-abiding people on the planet, I think you've lost the political plot. Good piece. It's the first article. I'd encourage you to read it in its entirety, and it's there for you. We come back, though. Let's, if we can, move away to a very important issue of inflation. I want to talk about the issue of inflation and also how do we think about this issue from a biblical point of view. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
No doubt you have heard discussions about herd immunity, but now some doctors are talking about super immunity. Vaccine immunity and immunity from infection don't seem to provide lasting protection for the Omicron variant, but it may be possible that the variant may give many of us super immunity. A study from the Oregon Health and Science University published in the Journal of the American Medical Association documents that a breakthrough infection generates robust immune response against the Delta variant. The study also found that antibodies measured in blood samples through breakthrough cases were more effective. In fact, they were measured as 1,000% more effective than antibodies generated 2 weeks following the second dose of the Pfizer vaccine. One of the authors of the study suggested that this might mean that there is an eventual end game to the pandemic. It didn't mean an end to the pandemic, but a tapering off of the severity of the worldwide epidemic. Our immune system depends on two types of white blood cells, T cells and B cells. The T cells circulate in the lymph nodes and bloodstream. One type of T cells infects the cells, while the other type of T cells signals B cells that enhance the immune response. These B cells increase the ability of the body to produce antibodies that can block new variants. This study parallels other studies. For example, a study from South Africa found that anyone infected with the Omicron variant produces antibodies that were much more effective at neutralizing the Delta variant. These studies provide some encouraging news. We're all weary of this pandemic and wonder if all the precautions and government policies will ever end. These studies suggest that a tapering is in the future. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's head out to Georgia first. Sue, thank you for calling today. I think you wanted to talk about masks.
Actually, it's in South Carolina.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. My thing is, and I pray every day about this, I do, that people need to start reading things instead of believing things. My point in case is I did legal research for attorneys for decades. When this mask mandate initially started, I was asked to do some legal research, which I did, and it was probably the easiest research I've ever had to do. Went out to the store, bought different brands of mask boxes, and on every single mask box that is available to the public, it has the exact same warning. It says this ear loop product does not prevent any diseases or transmission of any diseases, including COVID-19. People are listening to the idiots on the box instead of reading the box. We have become so lethargic and dependent upon being spoon-fed information. Nobody is reading the mask box. Nobody.
Well,
and
again, you work for a law firm, so you know why they have it on there, because anytime anybody gets sick, they can say, we didn't promise anything, so it gives them, it covers them.
I agree with you.
Yeah, no civil liability.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
But that sword cuts both ways. If you're not going to sit there and tell you that it's protective, then you can't mandate something that states it does
Yep, you keep cutting out, but I think we,
vomit.
unfortunately, your call keeps cutting out, but I think we got the point, and that is you can't, on the one hand, if the box says it doesn't protect you, can't make the mandate. But I think it's a good point, and we will probably get into this in more detail in the next hour because I really want to spend some time maybe just documenting some of the things that Dr. Leanna Wen pointed out. Again, don't forget that she was the former head of Planned Parenthood, but she and all the other doctors and now a number of Democratic governors are all saying, okay, end to the mask mandates. And just real quickly, for those of you that perhaps watch online, I thought I'd just make my case that I mentioned just a minute ago. Here, I'll hold up this one. This is from Reuters. Reminds us back in January, we had one day when we had a record number of COVID-19 cases, 1.35 million in one day, shattering a global record. And so at a time when we were told that maybe we should start scaling down, we actually go all the way back to January and had a record day for the number of cases. But you might say, okay, that's January. Okay, well, here's this one. This one comes from CNBC. COVID fatalities reached highest level in a year, and that one is in February. Now, we're only a few days away from when some of those records were set, or in the case of the one in January, a month away from when those records were set. And so you could honestly say, if you, quote, followed the science, you would actually say that we should do everything we can to actually increase the number of mandates, keep masks on, force individuals not only be vaccinated but boosted. And of course, that's just the opposite of what you're seeing. And as some wags have said before, we all knew when COVID-19 would no longer be an issue, and that's when the political part of the equation began to dominate over the, if you will, medical part of the equation. So anyway, just thought I would pass that on to you. We'll get back into it again in the next hour because I do have Timothy Kroll joining us in just a minute. But I did want to spend just a few minutes talking about inflation, and that is the consumer price index went up to 7.5% over the last year. That's where there's an additional surge of 0.6%. And so this is, again, the highest level for inflation in 40 years. And so you are going to be hearing more and more about that. The article goes on to remind us that what happens is that when you look at food, electricity, and shelter, that contributed to many of the increases. And it, I think, illustrates something I'm going to talk about in just a minute, how inflation hurts the middle class and the lower class. Wealthy people spend much less of their overall percentage of their income in food and energy because they make more. But if you are really living kind of day to day, and my wife and I, I'm thinking when we were first married, we didn't have a car. We're living in Connecticut. The only days we took the bus is when sometimes she would find money on the street. So I understand that sometimes people can be really tight in terms of their finances. And so if the price of food goes up just 5%, the price of gasoline goes up 5 or 10%, and much of it has gone up a whole lot more than that. If rent goes up 20%, as it has in some places, there's just no discretionary income. And so that's certainly the case. So right now, of course, the Federal Reserve is wanting to try to do what it can to deal with inflation. How do they do that? Well, they increased interest rates, but when you increase interest rates, and only even right now they're just fractionally going to increase them, it has an impact on the stock market. And so at the moment, the foot is on the brake, but very quickly that foot's going to be on the pedal again, and it illustrates again some of the issues that we're going to be dealing with for some time in terms of inflation. Wouldn't it be good to have a booklet on this subject of inflation? How are we as Christians supposed to think about that? Oh, here it is. This is the booklet we are sending out right now. And so if you have already been a member of the Truth Team, you'll receive this in the mail. It's coming pretty soon. And so you will be able to get that. If you say, well, I haven't joined the Truth Team, but I'd still like a copy, why don't you just send us an email email and we'll send you a digital copy, because this issue of inflation is something we need to really think about, because most countries and empires have dealt with inflation in the past, including Israel. You go back to the book of Isaiah, for example. Here God, speaking through the prophet Isaiah, says, "Your silver has become dross, your best wine mixed with water." And the problem was, even they were dealing with inflation because people were cheating each other by adding cheaper metals to the silver, and they were adding water to their wine. And if you think about it, inflation is almost like legal counterfeiting. You know, in the Roman Empire, counterfeiting was punishable by death. Even right now, we're going to be next hour talking about China. Counterfeiting in China warrants a life imprisonment. So yet governments today are so honest about, so demand that we be honest, is probably a better way to say that we be honest about our dealings. They insist on honest weights and measures. You see that every day when you go to a gas pump, and those are regulated to make sure that it's pumping the right amount of gas. But you go to, again, the Old Testament, Micah 6:11. "Shall I acquit the man with wicked scales and a bag of deceitful weights?" The concern is that there were individuals that used dishonest weights and measures, and that is certainly the case. You've heard us quote John Maynard Keynes before, and not that I like his economic theories, but he certainly identified the problem with inflation, because he said, by a continuing process of inflation, governments can confiscate secretly and unobserved an important part of the wealth of their citizens. He then went on to say, there is no subtler, no sure means of overturning the existent basis of society than to debauch the currency. The process engages all the hidden forces of economic law that come down on the side of destruction, and does so in a manner that not one man in a million is able to diagnose. And so I think we are living in a world right now where the government continues to run up debts. We are with a national debt of now $30 trillion, and we're always told that we're going to have to pay that back someday. Does anybody really believe that the government is going to pay back $30 trillion? Well, the Bible has something to say about that too. Psalm 37, verse 21, "The wicked borrows and does not pay back, but the righteous is gracious and gives." And of course, there is all sorts of concerns about bags of light weights, Deuteronomy 25, Proverbs 20. And we, as Christians, I think, should, number one, honor the Lord with your wealth and the first fruits of your harvest, and that's in Proverbs 3. And at the same time, also make sure that we get out of debt. You've heard us many times before, and we have our booklet here on the subject of debt as well, a very important issue that we address. And you can also see that in Proverbs 22:7, the rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is a servant to the lender. So unfortunately, during inflation times, people really don't want to pay off their debts, because then they get to pay them off in the future with devalued dollars or currency. But we should be honoring the Lord with our giving, honor the Lord by being good stewards of the financial resources, because then that gives us a platform to call for the government, in this case the federal government, to stop spending more than it takes in. That's a principle we use in our life, in our household. Can't we get the government to do the same? Well, that's a little bit on the subject of inflation. If you'd like to know some more, contact us at pointofview.net. We'll be back right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kirby Anderson.
We spend some time now talking about how to train pastors in some of these economically challenged countries who are oftentimes just one Bible study ahead of the congregation that they're teaching. And there's need, as we've talked about so many times, to train them. And so I thought it would be good for you to learn a little bit more about the Helios Projects, which is part of the Woodrow Kroll Ministries. Now, we've had Woodrow Kroll on this program before, especially when it was Back to the Bible. Matter of fact, my wife and I really enjoyed ministering with him up at Camp of the Woods a number of years ago. I followed his career, oftentimes spend a fair amount of time recommending some of his books, and of course talking about now his own ministry as well. The president of Woodrow Kroll Ministries is Timothy Kroll, and he is an individual that in the past has served as the senior pastor at Northside Baptist Church in Florida. Before that was the missions pastor at the Heritage Baptist Church in Lynchburg, Virginia, and also associate pastor for Northside as well. An individual that is now kind of leading the charge in this particular area. And we have a link to the heliosprojects.org. Of course, you don't have to remember all that because we have all of that at our website at pointofview.net. So, Timothy, thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Oh, it's my joy. Thanks for having me on.
Certainly appreciate your father, and it's great to meet you now for the first time and to really talk about this need. I have sometimes, when I've met people that we've encouraged to go on short-term missions, we'll have them say, well, I just don't know if I know that much about the Bible, and, you know, I might be a little inadequate. And I say, look, if you have been sitting in a Bible teaching church for years and maybe occasionally listening to TV preachers or radio preachers or reading some Christian books, you are probably further ahead than even some of the pastors who have become Christians and now find themselves leading a flock but desperately need the training. And that's why you have this project in the first place, isn't it?
Yeah, that's exactly why we have it, and you're exactly right in how you describe it. My dad tells the story that he was in China years ago and speaking with a gentleman that was not only training pastors, he was running a seminary training pastors. And so my dad, you know, just in conversation, wanted to find out, well, what's your educational background? Where did you get your training to be able to run a seminary and be able to train these other pastors? And he looked at him in all honesty and all sincerity and said, you know, there were missionaries that came to our village years ago, and that's how my parents came to faith in Christ. That's how I came to faith in Christ. And I try and remember the stories that the missionaries taught us when I was a child in Sunday school.
Wow.
And that was the limit of his training. And God bless him, he wasn't holding on to it. He was doing what he could with it, but it's all that he had.
Yes. Next hour, we're going to be talking with Stephen Mosher about China. And, of course, China's in the news right now, of course, because of the Olympics, but also because of the threat that has been to Christians and Uyghurs and others. But let's talk about this because we're encouraging people to go to your website. We already have a link to it. And as you go there, you'll see there are different ways that you can participate. But before we call for people to get involved, talk about what this entails, because there is perhaps the greatest need ever as the church is really being expanded and it's really growing and the Spirit is moving in these third world countries. There's a greater need than ever to train pastors, isn't there?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The estimates, not by our ministry, but several other great ministries that have done the legwork, as it were, put the number usually at 95%. Sometimes I'll say 90, but 95% of pastors around the world have little or no Bible or theology training. And the other number that I think is significant is if you ask those pastors, what's the number one thing we could do to help you? Is it funds? Is it Bibles? Is it buildings? Is it short-term trips? Is it media? What is it? What could we do that would most help you? 86% of those pastors say training. Imagine you're a man of God. You know God has called you. You know he wants you to preach. You know he wants you to evangelize your community. He wants you to shepherd a congregation. He wants you to preach his word so that those who hear it understand it and are able to walk in it. And then imagine you have no training, and so every time you open your mouth, you wonder. You have the Word of God, many of them do. You have the Spirit of God. You have all that is necessary, but you long for that friend that most of us have been blessed with, that you can talk about spiritual matters with. And that's the beauty, really, I think, of our project. We're not the only ministry out there. We love a lot of other great ministries. We partner with them. The need is so great. If you help one of them, you're helping the need, and we'd encourage to that. But to come alongside and try and be a friend and be. My dad taught these lessons as one friend sitting across the table or sitting on the floor of a hut with another friend. One friend wants to know God's word and just hasn't ever been taught God's word. And the other friend has been teaching it for 50 years and wants to take the blessing God has given him and share it with that other friend.
Well, again, we've talked about the need. Let's talk about the projects, and in particular, some of these units, because, again, as people go to the website, which, again, is the heliosprojects.org. Again, you don't have to remember even how to spell it, because we have all that at pointofview.net. They'll see some of these units. They'll see how you have various teams. So talk about what that looks like when you actually reach out to these individuals and provide them with this kind of training.
Yeah, and thank you for putting that on there because, I misspell Helios sometimes, so I imagine other people will as well. Thank you for putting that on your website. We have two projects. One is about the Christian faith. We call it Helios CT, or Helios Christian Theology. It's 199 sessions covering all 15 doctrines of the Christian faith. Each session is about 20 to 22 minutes in length, and so that makes it just over 70 hours of teaching. And it's audio in format, recognizing many of the pastors that we're trying to reach are those with the most obstacles. And so literacy is an obstacle. Education is an obstacle. So the first project is Christian Theology, 199 sessions. The second one is on God's story. What are the stories of the Bible? Most of the world, 70% of the world, learns or is functioning in a culture of orality. They're used to hearing things. They're used to stories rather than lecture and reading. And so the second project, we focus on 382 of the most important stories of the Bible. We cover those in 282 sessions. Each session, again, is 20 to 22 minutes in length, and so that makes it just over 90 hours. And stories all the way from Genesis to Revelation. And I think that's one of the strengths of our ministry and the work that my dad has done in putting these projects together is it's comprehensive. The theology one, it's every doctrine. The Bible project, it's every book of the Bible, not every story, but every book of the Bible. And so you have one teacher, you have a consistency of teaching, one teacher teaching the entire scope, as it were, of theology and Bible stories.
Well, again, and you have those in different languages. Your dad used to use the joke. He says, look, I don't know Mandarin. I know what Mandarin oranges are, but I don't know what Mandarin is. But you have those in Hindi and Mandarin and Portuguese and Russian and Swahili and Creole and Afrikaans and Thai. I mean, go down the long list. And so it is in one of the more common languages. It is amazing, Timothy, you probably, being a missions pastor, have been surprised, as I have as well. You can go to a lot of countries in the world where English is not necessarily a dominant language, and yet if they have access to a cell phone, they've learned English. Sometimes the focus is to learn English so that you can succeed, but if they're out on the internet or they have access to a phone, they have learned it. But if they need it in a language like Hindi or Mandarin or Portuguese or Russian or Spanish or Swahili, whatever it might be, that is the way in which it's done. But again, it's the teaching of your father, really kind of giving kind of a brief systematic theology and kind of a brief Bible overview. True?
True, yeah. And usually that's how we'll describe it to people here in the U.S. It's a systematic theology and a Bible commentary. That's your two projects. I want to be clear. We're working on all those languages. We're not done in all those languages. And so if somebody contacts us and, hey, I want this project in Bengali, we just started the translation on that.
Sure.
But we make them available on two different devices. One is a solar-powered audio player. Matter of fact, that's where we kind of get the name of the project. Helios is the Greek word for sun. That fireball in the sky that some would appreciate a lot more of at this time of year. And so we use a solar-powered audio player to deliver it to pastors who probably don't have their own technology, pastors who may not have electricity or reliable electricity.
Sure. Let me take a break because I
so,
want to come back after the break and talk about the other one because, again, you have a solar-powered audio player and also another one with USB. We'll talk about that and how people can participate. Talking with Timothy Kroll. It is called the Helios Projects, and we'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Timothy Kroll, the Helios Projects. And again, we have information about it on our website, and I would encourage you to look at that because then you can see the solar unit we were talking about. There's also another bonus feature, but most importantly, some of you might say, I would like to have one of those. Well, it's a very interesting situation that they have where you can buy one and then you receive it, but then it goes also, a second one goes to an untrained pastor, and we'll talk about some of the ways in which you can participate. But first of all, Timothy, you talked about this solar-powered unit, and so helpful because sometimes electricity, even in some of the more developed countries, is intermittent. As long as you have the sun, you have the words of Woodrow Kroll and the opportunity to begin to learn systematic theology and a Bible overview. But talk about the other unit that's available as well.
Yeah, the other is a USB drive. It looks kind of like probably every USB drive every listener out there has, except it has a standard USB on one end and and I always get this wrong, a micro USB on the other end, so you can plug it into your tablet or your phone. And it allows us to put all the audio files on there. So you plug it into your device, and however you listen to audio files, whether it's iTunes or Spotify or something like that, that you can listen to music on. You can load all the MP3s up and listen to them there. But it also then has a PDF of, we call it the notes, but it's actually the script. It's the
Yes.
document by which they recorded the audio and then translated into whatever language you happen to be listening to. So you can listen to it and read the notes or print off the notes. I always caution people, be careful. The first project, the notes are about 1,400 pages long, and the second project, they're about 1,800 pages long. So you'll run out of ink and paper if you just click print. You're probably going to want to only choose a particular lesson to print off.
And again, I think this is a great opportunity for people to say, well, I'd like to maybe help pastor in, I don't know, Brazil or India or Kenya or whatever. And you actually have pricing, basket pricing, so it's very inexpensive in those countries, recognizing they oftentimes have very little disposable income. But in a sense, you're putting two in their hands with the new electronic technology, a systematic theology, a Bible commentary, a variety of other things, which are actually very easy for them to use, and at the same time only depend on having solar power or having one of their devices that maybe they own. So how can people that are listening right now, Timothy, participate in this project? Because you have a number of different ways they can participate.
Yeah, we have individuals that are donors. They look and say, I've listened to Woodrow Kroll before. I'm listening to Christian radio or TV or reading right now. I'm not interested in getting one for me, but I want to help an untrained pastor get one. And so you can go on to either our websites and you can click on a donate button there. You can make a donation, and we'll use those funds help pay for units that we ship to untrained pastors. You might look and say, hey, I think I'd like to listen to this. And we have different individuals that do that. And we've kind of set it up with if you buy one, we'll give one to an untrained pastor. And the solar units cost us a fair bit more than the USBs. And so we say, buy one solar and we'll give a solar to someone. Buy a USB and we'll give 5 USBs to untrained pastors. And then we just keep track of the ones that come in. Right now, the Lord has blessed us with general donations that we're sending out more units than we're getting through matches. So every time a match comes in, it helps cover the expense of ones that we are already shipping out and wondering, Lord, how are you going to provide for that? And so far, he just has. We had an opportunity to come up about 6 months ago of a ministry in Brazil that ministers along the Amazon to the fishing villages there. And
yes.
I asked them, I said, how many units would you need? And they responded with the politeness of saying, well, how many could we have? And I knew what that meant. That meant they didn't want to ask for too many and, seem pushy. And I said, no, I want to know, how many do you need? And they said, well, give us a couple days. We'll come back with an exact answer. And a couple days later, they came back with the answer of, we need 173 USB units and 940 solar units.
Well, there you go.
Yeah. Yeah, so I laughed as well, and I told them, I said, we'll get them to you. And they said, really, you've already had somebody donate? I said, no, I haven't. I now got to find somebody to donate. So we've been raising funds to send those over 1,100 units to Brazil, and I've been working over the last couple of weeks, even with the gentleman there in Brazil, and it looks like we'll be going in August and visiting some of these fishing villages and some of these missionaries, Brazilian national missionaries, brothers and sisters in Christ that have given their lives to live on a houseboat to take the gospel up and down the Amazon River.
Again, you've been a missions pastor, and one of the things I'm going to encourage our listeners to do is take advantage of this. You know, when we sometimes have done our Truth Team events, we've actually sent people a Bible stick, and that's somewhat similar, only this one has much more information. And so we encourage our listeners to, get involved. It's not going to be very expensive, but you could really have an incredible blessing in the life of an untrained pastor in some area of the world. But if you wanted to pass this on, you recognize that there are a number of people listening, but not many of them are missions pastors. I would encourage our listeners to get some of this information and pass it on to the mission pastor in that church, because then that would be an opportunity to maybe even make this a missions project. Even if you can't go to Kenya or Nigeria or Afghanistan or maybe into China or even into Brazil or Guatemala or wherever it might be, you could still begin to train pastors, indigenous pastors there, so that they can reach out to people in their community and advance the gospel.
Yeah, absolutely. And another way we encourage people is if you're going on a short-term missions trip, and it happens to be an area that we have the projects done and translated in that language, and I recognize that's not going to be every place people go, but if it is a place that you're going, I encourage people, I challenge them, have everybody on the team take a unit with them. I guarantee you will run into at least one pastor who's untrained, and he knows other pastors that are untrained. And so of all the fruit of the trip you take, you could leave a Helios unit for each pastor that's there and see that fruit multiply and continue on into the future.
Well, again, we're not asking you to support Point of View today. We are asking you to consider clicking on that link to the heliosprojects.org. From time to time, we work on some of these projects to really advance the gospel. I was very excited about this. Of course, our friend Woodrow Kroll, and now, of course, we're getting to meet Timothy Kroll, are involved in that. A great organization, great ministry, and if you want to make a difference in the lives of some of these individuals that are dedicated to preaching God's word but need as much help as they can get, I would encourage you to get behind this. So, Timothy, say hi to your family and look forward to the next opportunity. Maybe you can share with us some of the things that happened as a result of this particular interview that we did with you today.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me on. I'll certainly share my greetings, your greetings with my parents. God bless you if you're listening. And the only thing you take out of this is a challenge to be in prayer for our brothers and sisters around the world. Then it's been a great time spent with you.
Well, that is certainly one thing we'll encourage you to do. And, of course, next hour, going to be talking with our friend Stephen Mosher. Wrote the book a number of years ago called The Bully of Asia, Why China's Dream is the New Threat to World Order. You think? Well, now it's in paperback, and he also has a new preface to that. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about China. And, of course, if you have some comments or questions about China, love to get your comments and interaction, because we'll open up the phones again, 1-800-351-1212. And then we'll get back. We did talk about masks. We'll get into a couple other issues, including who's going to be the party of the working class in these midterm elections. So we got a lot more to cover in the next hour. We'll do that right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
This hour we're talking about China, and there's a very good reason for it. Of course, we have the Olympics taking place, and also we have posted, and it's been up there for a couple of weeks, a fact sheet on boycotting the Beijing Olympics. You can decide whether or not you want to watch them, but the United States decided that they would still send athletes over there, and there are some reasons why we're real concerned, as illustrated by the fact, for those of you watching online, I'm holding up our October issue of Outlook with the title Empire Rising, China's Quest for Global Domination. Has my articles dealing with everything from Taiwan and global expansion all the way to Liberty's argument on human rights in Hong Kong, as well as Ivy's on countering China's long game, and of course a particular piece of information about the virus. And so whenever we want to talk about China, one of the individuals we've contacted over the years, and I was thinking back, I think even in the 1990s, Penna Dexter and I were doing interviews with Stephen Mosher. He is the president of the Population Research Institute, a leading authority on China, as well as an advocate for human rights. Some of his other books have included such things as A Mother's Ordeal, One Woman's Fight Against China's One-Child Policy, which we've been talking about for decades, Population Control, Real Cost, Illusory Benefits, and China Misperceived, American Illusions and China Reality. But back in 2017, his book Bully of Asia came out, and it is available, of course, in hardback, but I'm holding up the paperback edition of it now through Regnery. It is about 350 pages. More than 50 of those pages, by the way, are just endnotes to really provide some documentation. Bully of Asia, Why China's Dream is the New Threat to World Order, has a new preface, and Stephen Mosher joins us now by phone. Thank you for joining us today.
Good to be with you again, Kirby.
Let's, if we can, maybe get into it almost immediately, because we only have a little bit of time with you. But I remember the original book talked about China's zero-sum view of the world. Now, sometimes we would say in capitalism it's not a zero-sum game, it's a win-win. But for China, their victory is predicated upon our defeat. And I think we have been too willing to assume that China will play by the same rules that we do and really does not intend us harm. And yet we are seeing more and more evidence of the fact that what you predicted years ago is exactly what's playing out on the global scale.
The Chinese Communist Party makes up its own rules as it goes along. And those rules always benefit the Chinese Communist Party, especially the high-ranking elite members of that party, the members of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, are all fabulously wealthy men. Not that they produce anything in their lives, Kirby, except tyranny, but they have managed to expropriate much of the wealth of the hardworking Chinese people over the years, and they're all fabulously wealthy. So the whole idea of communism, of equity and equality, is just a fabrication. It's just an excuse for political control forever and ever. Amen. But what China's view of the world is in the future, it doesn't want to become a member of the current world order, which is dominated by the United States and the West in general, and our principles of human rights and freedom of association, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion. It wants to replace it with a new world order dominated by, force and the threat of the use of force.
And again, one of the other aspects of that is what you have referred to as information warfare, because we have a fair amount of true disinformation. Right now, the word misinformation, disinformation is being misused, but I think you could fairly say that the Chinese Communist Party uses disinformation every single day. It depends oftentimes on foreign media outlets, even here in the United States, to pass on that kind of disinformation and then to try to censor anybody that tries to tell the true story about the Chinese Communist Party.
Absolutely. The Chinese Communist Party leaders are masters of deceit. They seized power in China by winning the Civil War by using propaganda to brainwash people. They also used united front tactics to burrow into and destroy from the inside their enemies. And finally, of course, they used the Red Army, the People's Liberation Army. But before that, before they went kinetic, before they started firing bullets, they had weakened the hearts and minds and institutions and organizations of their enemies. And they're doing the same thing today in the United States and the West. Through their Confucius Institutes on American college campuses, they're trying to win the hearts and minds of young American students by convincing them that communism and socialism is the road to the future, is the winning formula. They're trying to hollow out American institutions, including buying radio and TV stations and ads in major newspapers and using them for their own purposes. And, of course, they spent tens of millions hiring lobbyists in Washington, D.C., who are often former senators and congressmen, to lobby their still sitting fellows to craft policies towards China that favor the Chinese Communist Party and ultimately, favor the idea that China is becoming and will become the dominant power in the world. I think we can prevent that, but there are a lot of people in Washington, D.C. who think that by serving China and the Chinese Communist Party, they're on the winning side of history.
Didn't quite work out so well when he brought them into the World Trade Organization and a number of other things. Again, Bully of Asia, Why China's Dream is the New Threat to World Order by Stephen Mosher. And one of the things in your preface has to do with the fact that we have a virus out of China. Now, back in 2017, if you had predicted that gain of function would be used to develop a virus that eventually would devastate the world, people would have actually consigned you to a rubber room and even said that's the worst conspiracy theory I can possibly imagine. But isn't it interesting that China only has one level 4 lab, and I'm convinced, although some still are not convinced, that it came from that lab. Your thoughts?
Oh, yeah, it came from that lab without a doubt. I think that everybody on the virology front is clear on that point now. They're just not willing to say so because Dr. Anthony Fauci still has control of a $6 billion budget. He funds probably more than half of all the virology and immunology research in the world from his shop at the National Institutes of Health. And, a lot of people are not willing to offend their major funder. They're also not willing to think badly of their Chinese colleagues. And, look, I don't know whether their Chinese colleagues are working for the People's Liberation Army because they really have signed on to the idea that China is to become the dominant power in the world, and one way is to develop bioweapons to weaken and destroy its enemies, or whether they've just, they're committed communists, or whether they've just been coerced into doing this. But at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter because it was created in the lab. There are unusual insertions in the backbone of this naturally occurring coronavirus that make it more infectious. And that was done in the lab in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and then it was released on the world. Now, I said this back in February of 2020, and I was criticized by all of Dr. Fauci's flacks in the virology community who signed a joint letter, about 24 of them, saying, anybody who says this came from the lab is a conspiracy theorist. And I was taken down by Twitter and Facebook after writing an article in the New York Post. And now, of course, they're all admitting the same thing. That's what, by the way, that's what the Trump administration concluded during its last few weeks in office. They concluded it came from the lab.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about hegemony, is also how do we begin as a country to address some of the intentions of the Chinese Communist Party. We'll continue our conversation with Stephen Mosher right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
No doubt you have heard discussions about herd immunity, but now some doctors are talking about super immunity. Vaccine immunity and immunity from infection don't seem to provide lasting protection for the Omicron variant, but it may be possible that the variant may give many of us super immunity. A study from the Oregon Health and Science University published in the Journal of the American Medical Association documents that a breakthrough infection generates robust immune response against the Delta variant. The study also found that antibodies measured in blood samples through breakthrough cases were more effective. In fact, they were measured as 1,000% more effective than antibodies generated 2 weeks following the second dose of the Pfizer vaccine. One of the authors of the study suggested that this might mean that there is an eventual end game to the pandemic. He didn't mean an end to the pandemic, but a tapering off of the severity of the worldwide epidemic. Our immune system depends on two types of white blood cells, T cells and B cells. The T cells circulate in the lymph nodes and bloodstream. One type of T cells infects the cells, while the other type of T cells signals B cells that enhance the immune response. These B cells increase the ability of the body to produce antibodies that can block new variants. This study parallels other studies. For example, a study from South Africa found that anyone infected with the Omicron variant produces antibodies that were much more effective at neutralizing the Delta variant. These studies provide some encouraging news. We're all weary of this pandemic and wonder if all the precautions and government policies will ever end. These studies suggest that a tapering is in the future. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, continue our conversation today with Stephen Mosher. Book is entitled Bully of Asia. And I do want to talk a little bit about the fact that we have been in this conflict with Russia and China. And, of course, there has been kind of a split between Russia and China for some time. But I think it is interesting that in one of your chapters, you open up with a quote from Samuel Huntington. And back when I was a graduate student at Georgetown, I had a chance to be on a panel with him. But a new Cold War, Deng Xiaoping reportedly asserted in 1991, is underway between China and America. So it does seem to me that really for 30 years we've had a Cold War that people in the mainstream press have never wanted to acknowledge. Your thoughts?
Well, if the leader of China, and Deng Xiaoping was the leader of China in 1991, he's the one who orchestrated coming out of retirement the Tiananmen massacre, which killed 10,000 people in the streets of the capital city. If Deng Xiaoping summoned his senior leaders in September of 1991 and declared that the old Cold War is over, the U.S. has defeated the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union has collapsed, but the new Cold War is now beginning between China and the United States, I think we ought to take him at his word. Because look, if Kirby, if your enemy says you're at war, you're probably at war whether you want to be or not. And China has been at war with us across all domains, except the kinetic. We're not firing bullets at each other for the last 31 years.
You know, Samuel Huntington, I should say, first of all, was the one talking about the fact that we would have a conflict between us and China, but also between us and radical Islam. And I think we realized in terms of terrorism that they were at war with us, even when we didn't realize that we were at war with them. The same kind of issue. But you talk quite a bit through this book about this idea of hegemony and what that means, because I think most people tend to see China primarily as a great market. I mean, try to find me more than one or two NBA players that would say anything negative about China. Try to find somebody in Hollywood right now that say anything about China, or anybody in Silicon Valley that would, because they are dependent upon that. But I think the American people are a little smarter and recognize that right now this is a country that's on the march, and it wants to build islands. It wants to take back Taiwan. It wants to assert its influence all over the world, and has been doing that in a pretty effective way, hasn't it?
Well, it has. It's been marching forward on all fronts for decades now. And, you know, the pandemic that China released on the world has, I think, clarified the minds of many Americans who once thought, well, China's far away and it really doesn't affect our daily life much. And so what if we buy a few Chinese-made goods in the big box stores? What does that matter in the grand scheme of things? Well, a lot of us have gotten sick from a virus that was created in the lab and deliberately released on the world. And opinion polls, not just in the U.S., but in all countries around the world, from Japan, South Korea, to Europe, and to the United States and Canada, show that negative attitudes towards the Chinese Communist Party. Let's make sure we specify that we're talking about the Chinese Communist Party here and not the Chinese people. The negative attitudes towards China, dominated by the Chinese Communist Party, have just skyrocketed. And now they're up at 80%, 85% or so, 90% in some countries. So people now realize that China is a threat. And what does China want in the world of the future? The world of the future, according to the Chinese Communist Party, will have all of the industrial base of the world in China. China will be the factory floor that produces everything. The rest of the world has three things to do to serve China. One, to provide food for China's workforce. Two, to provide raw materials for China's factories. And three, to be passive, sheep-like consumers of Chinese products. Now, that's not a world I want to live in.
I would certainly say that is one of the reasons why we wanted to focus on your book. But also, let me just real quickly mention your website, which is pop.org, stands obviously for Population Research. And this, again, is a way in which you can certainly focus on human life, or the sanctity of human life, but also you've written about population control, even climate change and the rest. But I'd be remiss, Stephen, if I didn't spend just a little bit of time getting your thoughts about the Olympics. We talked the other day with Reggie Littlejohn, and of course we've certainly focused on the fact that we think that even if we as a country are not boycotting the Olympics, on the other hand, although I support American athletes, I don't want to support them in a situation that actually in every single way seems to be violating the idea of human rights, the spirit, really the so-called human spirit, which the Olympics are supposed to be a part of. And so that's why I know you have been speaking out about the fact that this was a terrible mistake to have the Winter Olympics in Beijing.
Yeah, China's committing every human rights in the book, a violation in the book, and they're committing it on a grand scale. And we talk about the Uyghurs, genocide of the Uyghurs, forced abortion, forced sterilization of Uyghur women. But now, of course, the Han Chinese women are being encouraged by the Chinese Communist Party to have more children, not fewer. So it's selective abortion of minorities. That fits the technical definition of genocide. Lots of horror stories we could talk about there. But the other thing that worries me is there is a spreading epidemic in North China. We don't know exactly what it is, Kirby. They've suggested that it's Delta, but who knows? We do know one thing about the Chinese Communist Party. They're experts in manipulating information and in deceit. And so the thing that jumped out at me a couple of weeks ago was when one country announced it was not sending its athletes to China. What country was that? That was North Korea, China's only treaty ally, sitting right across the Yalu River from Manchuria, where there is an epidemic raging, has said, we're not sending our athletes to Beijing because we're afraid of this new epidemic. What do they know that we don't know?
And again, that's the kind of information we like to cover here on Point of View. And I'm glad you brought that up because we don't want to get people afraid. But I can remember this time 2 years ago when we said, something's coming out of Wuhan, probably came out of the Wuhan Institute for Virology. And of course, if you said that, or especially if your name was Senator Tom Cotton, I've talked about being vilified, or if your name was Stephen Mosher, you get vilified. And yet here we're again seeing another epidemic, and hopefully it will stay in that country. But I think we've learned that doesn't happen. And that's just the kind of information we want people to begin to know about. But just before I let you go, of course, we also have a chapter in which you talk about what America can do. I'll be honest, I'm not sure how much this president wants to do anything in terms of China, but what can maybe we as individuals do, and especially if it's a midterm election as it is this year, what kind of questions should we be asking of our elected officials about their understanding of the threat of China?
Well, first of all, we still control our own destiny. We can win this competition, and we should, for the sake of future generations of Americans and for the sake of the Chinese people themselves. The Chinese economy is bankrupt. It depends on infusions of cash from Wall Street. We can shut that down by shutting them out of our stock market. It depends on transfers of technology and science. We can stop that by cutting into Chinese cyber espionage and stopping spying at our major research universities. And the final thing we have to know is that China is on a demographic disaster course.
Yes.
It has killed 400 million unborn children over the past 30 years. They are desperate for more children. Their population is aging and dying. So taking all of that together, if we adopt the same policies for China that we adopted successfully under Reagan in the 1980s, we can defeat the Chinese Communist Party, and we should.
Sounds like we're fighting another one of those Cold Wars. And again, they are in, if you will, a demographic winter and also an economic disaster. But just before I let you go, let me just mention that, again, as people go to your website, and we have that link there, they can get your weekly bulletin. And that's where you actually are documenting all sorts of human rights abuses from all sorts of countries, not just China. And so if people want to know a little bit more about your book, we have that linked there as well. Of course, the hardback has been around for a while, but this paperback is available. Of course, you can also get it in Kindle. And again, it is published by our friends at Regnery, and 350 pages, more than 50 pages just of endnotes. So if you say, well, I want to look that up myself, you've made it very easy to do so. And Stephen Mosher, I appreciate your courage and your tenacity and your persistence, because we've been doing these interviews for some time, and it's always great to have you on the program here on Point of View.
It's always good to talk to you, Kirby. You're a voice of reason and truth.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to get into a couple of other issues in the news. Because of that virus, we can talk about masks. I'll get into that, and a couple other issues as well. Last half hour, perhaps you have some comments or questions. We certainly went through this fairly quickly, but if you're not familiar with some of the concerns that we have about China, the October issue, which I'm holding up right now, of Outlook, I know we have extra copies. We could send that to you. Of course, you can get the fact sheet, which we have on our website right now, about the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics. And then, of course, we have information about this now paperback edition of the book, quite readable, and just a reminder of what China is and giving you some of the history, but now updated with, of course, information that back in 2017 we didn't have about the virus and about what we can do in this country to address the real significant threats from the Chinese Communist Party. And I appreciate him pointing out the fact we're not against the Chinese people. We are against the Chinese Communist Party. There's a difference, although people like to blur those so they can criticize us. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach. by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Final half hour. Let's, if we can, talk about a couple of other issues in the news. About an hour ago, we talked about the issue of inflation. And by the way, we do have our booklet on inflation, which we'll be mailing to those of you that are donors. And if you're not a donor but would like to get a copy, of course, we could get one to you as well. And my commentary yesterday was on the subject, and I'm going to get into the commentary today and the whole issue of masks. But my commentary yesterday on February 9th really was based upon a very good piece that came out from, again, the editors of the Wall Street Journal, because the way they put it, the country may be upset with inflation, but in many ways, political Washington has never had it better. And the point is that the pandemic, as they say, has always been an excuse for record government spending and the abuse of regulatory power, such as what we'll be talking about in just a minute, vaccine mandates and an eviction moratorium and the rest. But increasing tax revenues because of inflation are pouring into the Treasury. Because we distributed so much money, of course, a lot of it's coming back into the Treasury. And when you look at the first quarter, now the first quarter of the federal government runs from October to December. The end of it is September 30th. Just kind of an interesting phenomenon there. But again, the income into the federal treasury went up 31%. It was an increase of an additional 31%. Almost unprecedented, or to put it another way, an increase of an additional $248 billion of a $1 trillion into a quarter. We have never seen anything like that before. And of course, it comes from individual income taxes, but also from corporate income taxes. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that inflation increases what's called the nominal GDP. A 7% increase in inflation leads to higher nominal profits, wages, and salaries. And so as a result, you would say, well, they brought in so much more money, I bet they balanced the budget. No, they didn't. You know the answer to that one. And so, again, the government still had a $377 billion budget deficit just in the first quarter alone, which I think illustrates a point we've made before, and that is it isn't that people in America are undertaxed. It is the government has overspent, and that continues down the road. So anyway, yes, for some people, inflation is a good deal, and I point out that you will probably see all sorts of articles coming out saying inflation's not as bad as you think it is. It's actually quite good. And quite frankly, it is good for example, various governments, because now you'll get more taxes and you'll get more income. And it's really good for people that are really close to the money printer. That's Wall Street and that's the elite. It's terrible. It is disastrous for the middle class and lower classes in America. And we've talked about that before. Now, my commentary today is called super immunity. I suspect you probably first heard about it here on Point of View. It comes from a study that was done by the Oregon Health and Science University, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, in which they found that some of these breakthrough infections, that would be somebody who has been vaccinated, had one or two of the vaccinations, depending on whether you had Johnson & Johnson or AstraZeneca or Moderna or Pfizer, whatever, some that have had a booster, some that have not. And what it tends to do is generate what they call robust immune response. So they came up with this idea of super immunity. It has to do, and I go into it in some detail, I won't right now, in terms of the way in which your immune system, your T cells and your B cells, how they react. And those B cells continue to then develop this kind of immune response, which is really significant. And so this study out of Oregon has also been replicated in a number of other places. For example, South Africa has found it and a variety of others. And so that is, again, probably good news, and again, probably will be used to justify in the minds of many of these individuals why we no longer need a mask mandate. Our good friend Gary Bauer put it this way: the coronavirus has caused many of us to mask up in the last 2 years. Ironically, it was unmasked that the authoritarian impulses and hypocrisy of our political class, particularly on the left. He said, while your 5-year-old is forced to wear a mask and produce a vaccine passport to go to McDonald's. Hardly a day goes by when we don't see a liberal mayor, left-wing member of Congress, progressive Hollywood celebrity flouting the rules. And, of course, as you might imagine, he uses the picture of Stacey Abrams smiling, surrounded by all the other kids who could be smiling, but they're all wearing masks and she is not. And, of course, we've seen some other pictures. She said, well, that's just a one-off. Now we saw some other places where she didn't have it. And, of course, we have all sorts of other examples. In the past, we've talked about, as he does here, Nancy Pelosi getting her hair done at a time when actually we weren't supposed to be doing that, and she's unmasked. Gavin Newsom with various lobbyists. Of course, the mayor of Los Angeles the other day with Magic Johnson unmasked. Then Mayor Garcetti then claiming that he held his breath, didn't inhale. I think I heard Bill Clinton say that before. But anyway, we'll have all sorts of fun with that. But the point is that all of a sudden now, as I talked about on Monday, I went through this long list of various Democratic governors, and he mentioned just one. That is the governor of New Jersey, Phil Murphy, who is lifting the mask mandate. But so are so many others, because I suspect it has to do with politics more than it has to do with science. In just a minute, I'm going to read from some of the articles. Matter of fact, it's one of the other articles we've posted on the website. But for those of you that are absolutely convinced that this is due to the change in science, which is the argument we're going to get from Dr. Leanna Wen, I again will hold up for those of you watching online. This one, which again comes from Reuters, which reported one day in January where we had 1.35 million cases in one day. We set a global record for the most number of cases, COVID cases, in January. And you might say, well, yeah, but it's February. It's February 10th, so that's old news. Okay, well, this one is from our friends at CNBC, Associated Press. I just grabbed this one because it looks better graphically, in which, again, COVID fatalities reached the highest level in a year. More people died in that day just recently in February than in any other time in the last year. So those are the numbers that would actually, if anything, you would assume be used to suggest maybe we need to keep the mask mandates going a little bit longer. And if you assume that, you would be wrong. Again, don't take my word for it. We've posted a couple of articles, one of these from Scott Moorfield. We've also got another one here from Kyle Smith. So we'll read those real quickly before we take a break. And again, Dr. Leanna Wen, you might remember she was the former head of Planned Parenthood. And I have one of her posts here in which she was talking about the fact that maybe it would be time to lift the mask mandate, because she quotes from an op-ed that came from 3 doctors calling for the fact that it probably would make sense to lift those masks finally. And then these updates are supposedly, she says, appropriate from a scientific standpoint. They offer a pathway to compromise in the place where masking policies are actually hotly debated, especially in the schools. But if I can do kind of a back to the future for just a minute, let's go back in time and let's go look at a couple of things that she has posted on Twitter on December 20th. This is 7 weeks ago. The point is that cloth masks, she says, are little more than facial decoration. So she was critical of cloth masks, and then goes on to simply say that what we need to do is not just use cloth masks any longer, but what we should do is use triple ply masks. Again, I'm quoting from her. My point isn't that we don't need masks, but rather we should require masks that are more effective in preventing disease transmission. Everyone, including children, should be wearing at least a 3-ply surgical mask when indoors and around others of unknown vaccination status. That's what she said 7 weeks ago. And so that's where she made this very famous statement that don't wear a cloth mask because they're just facial decorations. And now we are starting to see some of the comments being made that, you know, it's probably just good that we don't necessarily have to continue to wear those masks. And that did not escape the attention of one Senator Ron Johnson. Some of you have encouraged me to watch the hearings that he's actually pulled together, and I've had a chance to do do so. And so he says, isn't that interesting? Public health experts, this is his tweet, like Dr. Leanna Wen, went from a pro-government mandate that it should be then an individual choice because the science has changed. He says the science never changed, but they can no longer deny the truth. Now, she had a pushback from that saying, well, we didn't have vaccines for children 5 to 11 until November. We now have vaccines that protect well against Omicron. No, they don't. And we have one-way masking with N95, KN95 protects wearers. That's her best kind of feeble response to it. But are we seeing a remarkable change in mask mandates? Yes, I think we're going to see more in the future. I think it probably has as much to do with the fact that we're now in the midterm elections. Next Monday, I get to vote in a midterm election, and you will be too. And that's changed everything. I don't think it's motivated so much by the science as by the politics. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just give you a program note that tomorrow will be our weekend edition. We'll have Around the Round Table, Penna Dexter and Lathan Watts, and some of what we'll be talking about here in this segment before we say goodbye is something I want to get Lathan Watts' thoughts about, because the question is, which party will be the party of the working class? Historically, that's always been the Democratic Party. Is that going to be in the future? And that, I think, is illustrated by this last article that we've posted for you to read. And a lot of it centers around Marco Rubio. Now, again, for those of you that maybe forget, he is a senator from Florida running for re-election. And the other day, he made the statement, GOP voters are working-class Americans, and they are changing the party. Well, again, this piece that comes from Common Sense, which isn't necessarily a conservative outlet, but certainly does a good job of covering stories that sometimes the mainstream press ignores. They go on in this article to say that's the message that Marco Rubio emphasized when he spoke on the phone a few days ago. But the line could have just as easily come from a host of Republicans: Tom Cotton, Ron DeSantis, Josh Hawley, J.D. Vance. By the way, again, for those of you not in Ohio, J.D. Vance running for the Senate there. Of course, we've interviewed him before on his book. Penna Dexter actually did that interview. But again, they believe their political future and that of their party is dependent on embracing the working class. Now, to put in perspective, Marco Rubio, again, Senator Rubio is a son of a Las Vegas bartender and a maid. So in some respects, he associates with and is willing to quite interact with those kinds of individuals. And the article goes on to say that last week, the Florida senator, together with Congressman Jim Banks from Indiana, introduced a new bill that would require companies with profits over $1 billion, that's Amazon, Google, Walmart, to give workers the opportunity to elect a representative to serve on their corporate boards. The bill is called the Teamwork for Employees and Managers, or the TEAM Act, which would allow the formation of voluntary organizations with employers and employees for the purpose of discussing matters of mutual interest, such as the quality of work, productivity, efficiency, compensation, and more. In other words, what it would be is sort of like unions, except not unions. And Marco Rubio says federal labor law prevents workers from organizing outside of a formal union process, and that's what the TEAM Act would allow. Again, does it have a chance of passing in this Congress? No. But with a different Senate after these midterm elections, it's a possibility. Anyway, they go on to say that Rubio's bill is really something that's sort of like it's navigating between, for example, the pro-corporation right and the progressive union left. And he is arguing in this piece that there is sort of a new lane that casts itself as both pro-business and pro-worker. If the capital L labor movement had traditionally put workers in an adversarial relationship with management, and if the pro-business right had historically ignored the plight of workers altogether, some of these what they call new populists, like Marco Rubio, are seeking a way to give workers more power while circumventing the unions that obviously are more aligned with the Democratic Party. I want to ask Lathan about this, but we used to talk about some of those individuals that were kind of the Reagan Democrats and the Union Democrats that actually supported Ronald Reagan, and some of them that also supported, interesting enough, Donald Trump. And so Rubio said, we focus so much on things like, what is the stock market today? Is it up or is it down? What are the statistics on the unemployment rate and things of that nature? Those are not meaningless, but they don't really capture the most important thing that an economy does. The most important thing an economy does for a country is create stable, good-paying jobs so that people can start families, get involved in their communities, and retire with dignity. And so the question becomes, what can we do at the federal level to encourage that kind of economy? I love him thinking outside the box, and I think this is going to be an interesting part of these midterm elections, and perhaps you would like to weigh in and perhaps like to read this article in its entirety, because I won't have time to cover all of it. But I think it is interesting that there are a lot of people right now that are actually identifying more as Republicans. They may not be registered as Republicans, but they are. Bloomberg News analysis, for example, in 2020, found that truckers, construction workers, carpenters, builders, electricians, cops, mechanics, and maintenance employees were among the occupations most likely to give to candidate Donald Trump. And again, you can see where that plays out. You might say, well, who gave to Joe Biden? Well, that was teachers, professors, therapists, lawyers, HR department staff, finance professionals, and bankers. So you have an interesting split that has never really existed in the modern time of a Republican and Democratic Party. Again, this article goes on to say that Marco Rubio isn't the only one who's noticed. Senators Mitt Romney and Tom Cotton introduced a bill in February last year that laid out a path to a $10 minimum wage. Senator Josh Hawley proposed a bill that would mandate that 50% of all critical goods be manufactured in the U.S. Texas Governor Greg Abbott and Governor of Florida Ron DeSantis have both used the pandemic to brand themselves as populist, and Marco Rubio has been very critical, as you might imagine, of Amazon, recently putting out a letter calling for a federal investigation of the company's labor practices. And finally, this article says, if you want to get a sense of where this is going, all you have to do is look to, well, we talked about the program at the beginning, Canada, where you have seen all sorts of people protesting the vaccine mandate. You've already heard me mention that not quite 90%, but 86% are already vaccinated. So it's not the vaccine that's the issue. It's the mandates that's the issue, and the whole issue of the Freedom Convoy. And the whole idea of Karl Marx was workers of the world unite. Except these workers seem to be uniting around those parties in there, the Conservative Party in this country, the Republican Party, which you wouldn't necessarily have seen them uniting around. And so that is the case. And as this article says, this spectacle of workers fulfilling Marx's fantasy only to be speared by the very people who claim to prioritize the working class captures, he says, in stark relief the split emerging between the working class and the left that used to represent them. And so Marco Rubio says the reason why they are protesting is because they want to be allowed to work, and in exchange they're treated in the media as if they're a dangerous group. And so he uses that as just an example of a remarkable split that may be taking place. And it also, I think, surfaces when you see the remarkable difference between the elite and the working class. And we pointed out that in terms of masks as well. The idea is you have to wear your mask, but if I'm caught without a mask, well, that's just the way it is, because after all, I'm part of the elite. And one more piece of advice I would give to any of you listening right now that are running for office: you need to run on a platform saying, I want to make sure that not only if I'm elected, but everyone that is working with me in that level of government, whether it's city council, whether it's state legislature, whether it's Congress, whatever it might be, that we all abide by the same laws. There's no gap between the elite that have privilege and the rest of us that have to live under those laws. So I think that's another one of those issues that we will probably discuss tomorrow. And we'll have Penna Dexter with us and Lathan Watts. If you find yourself saying, I'd like to know a little bit more about some of the conversation that you had today with Timothy Kroll and Stephen Mosher, we have those articles on the website. A couple of good articles that I wanted to commend to you to read and take the time to print them out, maybe pass them on to others. And we are looking forward to a good discussion tomorrow with that roundtable discussion. And of course, we welcome your phone calls as well. Thank you, Andrew and Steve, for your help behind the scenes. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-3776. 5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.